The email arrived like a punch during a massage, sudden, violent, and completely out of place. It was 7:13 a.m., and Sarah had just poured coffee into a chipped mug that read, "Teamwork makes the dream work." A gag gift from a Christmas party that had cost her 2 all-nighters and a missed flight to her sister's wedding. Outside, the mist clung to the pines like breath on a mirror, and for a moment the world was finally quiet. Then came the subject line, "Important update regarding your role asterisk." Sarah didn't open it right away. Her hands froze, still wrapped around the warmth of the mug, as a sick feeling churned in her gut, twisting like something rotten. She wasn't paranoid. She knew Vyarch systems had been circling the drain, slashing costs like a fish someone forgot to flush. But she had made herself untouchable. Or so she thought. When she finally opened it, the words, "Your role has been eliminated," hit her like a slap. Severance canceled. Enjoy the rest of your vacation. She didn't scream, didn't throw the mug, didn't send a rage text. She just laughed sharp, loud enough to send a squirrel darting across the deck railing like it owed someone money. Sarah stood barefoot on the creaky pine boards, staring at her phone while steam curled from her cup, and thought, so, this is how they do it asterisk. Day 3 of her first vacation in 14 years. Not even a phone call, just corporate cowardice in Calibri font. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She took a photo of the email, not because she needed proof. It was all time-stamped, but because part of her wanted to frame it. Maybe hang it above her fireplace. A shrine to the moment she stopped giving a damn. She'd begged for this PTO, not asked, begged. After burning herself down to ash trying to salvage a failing product line that no one else had the courage to kill. She'd finally pulled her emergency brake. 8 months of 60-hour weeks, a sprained wrist she never reported, and one particularly bleak week where she ran a Q4 client forecast while wearing a hospital wristband from an overnight ER visit. All of that just to get 2 weeks off. And now she was being erased like a typo. A breeze rustled the trees. The silence after that email felt almost violent. A flashback hit her. The meetings that led to this moment, the gaslighting, the endless asterisk now's not the right time, the excuses when she'd asked for time off. The hushed HR calls she wasn't invited to, but overheard whispers about the CFO's smile during the restructuring town hall. Smirking like synergy was a personality trait. It all reeked of a slow, surgical betrayal. Sarah hadn't just been tired, she'd been done. That's why she'd gotten smart. 6 months ago, when they begged her to absorb the dying Phoenix team's outdated, Frankenstein code base that no one else would touch, she made a counteroffer. "I'll do it," she said, "but I want a contract revision." The legal guy had skimmed it. The CFO wanted the PR win. They just wanted the team off their books. She got her signature, and now she had this. She glanced down at her phone again. The email was still open, still smirking. She could almost hear the HR director's voice, nasal and passive-aggressive. "You should be proud of what you've contributed, Sarah, but Vi is moving in a leaner direction." Leaner meant cheaper. Cheaper meant headcount cuts. Headcount cuts meant her. Sarah set the phone down on the table, didn't reply, not yet. She walked outside, let the cold mountain air slap her awake, and stared into the trees like they had answers. They didn't, but she did, because they had no idea what they had just triggered. Not yet. But they would. Era didn't cry. She didn't even blink for 30 seconds. She sat back in the stiff, overstuffed leather chair by the cabin's window, her phone still warm in her hand like it had just whispered a slur. Outside, a blue jay picked at the railing. A deer nosed through the leaves by the tree line. The world kept breathing while Sarah went still. The numbness came first, familiar, the freeze she'd trained into herself after years of corporate manipulation. It started in her chest, tight and hollow, and crawled up the back of her neck like a hand about to squeeze. Then, slowly, a different sensation bubbled up from beneath. Not panic, not grief, clarity, ice-cold, surgical clarity. The kind that comes when the fire burns out and you can finally see through the smoke. She didn't need to call anyone. No venting, no panic spiral, no whiskey or wind screaming off the deck. Just forward the damn email. But first, she opened files. Older Phoenix acquisition, HR addendum, contract revision signed, it was still there. Of course it was, she triple-backed it up. Her insurance policy. The flashback hit her hard, 6 months earlier. A long hallway, glass doors. the CFO's cheap cologne, smelling of old gin and newer lies. They cornered her during Q2. You're the only one with the seniority and insight to turn the Phoenix team around. Translation. No one else wanted to babysit the fossil crew and their aging code base. Half of them were writing out pensions and long lunches, while the other half were interns with laptops older than their student loans. Sarah said yes, but only on her terms. She drafted the contract revision herself. Not the whole thing, just enough to slide in a little clause with teeth, wedged between retention bonuses and annual performance reviews. Clause 12.4b. Termination during approved PTO without documented cause shall be treated as a breach of protected employment status, triggering automatic restitution penalties. She remembered walking the draft to legal. Their senior counsel was out sick again, so a junior paralegal gave it a once-over and rubber-stamped it. The CFO signed it that afternoon, distracted and grinning. "We trust you, Sarah," he said, sipping a Diet Coke like he was closing a car deal. They didn't trust her. They just didn't read. Now she was watching the payoff click into place like gears locking shut. She opened a new email. No flourish, no subject line fireworks. She just forwarded the termination notice and the full PDF contract to her lawyer with a simple 3-word subject. "Let me know when to smile." She set the phone face down and exhaled for the first time since the morning mist. Betrayal doesn't always come with drama. Sometimes it's dressed in HR language and a smiley face emoji. Sometimes it rides in on a Friday afternoon Zoom invite marked *quick sync*. But this was surgical. They waited until she was 3 days into her first vacation in 14 years. Until her out-of-office was active, her Slack closed, and her calendar empty. They thought they'd picked the perfect time. Sarah hoped they enjoyed it. The silence, the clean, bloodless little ambush. Because that was the last moment they'd feel in control. She could almost hear her lawyer now, chuckling. Jack Lavine, ex-Marine turned employment assassin. She'd hired him during a different round of corporate treachery and kept him on retainer ever since. The man ate HR departments for breakfast and flossed with exit clauses. He'd see the email, he'd see the contract, and then all hell would politely, contractually break loose. Sarah didn't feel rage. Not yet. Just a humming under her skin, like thunder stuck behind clouds. She sat there while the sun burned off the last of the mist, sipping cold coffee, rereading her own contract like it was a prophecy. They wanted to cancel her severance. Fine, they'd just bought themselves a reckoning. Let's talk optimization wins. That's how the CFO started the meeting. He was announcing a new flavor of yogurt, bright and chipper in a voice that had never seen an overtime sheet or a missed anniversary dinner. He stood in front of the glossy investor deck like a game show host who had just solved headcount. In bold green font, a slide appeared. Q3 Savings Workforce Rebalancing*. Below it, a bullet point that read like a eulogy for Logic, Legacy Team Realignment. Sarah Wren role absorbed. Associated costs reallocated. No mention of the Phoenix team. No mention of the 14-hour days. Just absorbed like she was a coffee stain on a spreadsheet. They finally figured out how to blot. The investors nodded with the slow indifference of people who only cared about stock price and not the body count behind it. The kind of men who said things like *trim, the fat asterisk, and synergies, and meant people with lives, mortgages, and kids with braces. Exile severance reallocations. That one was the CFO's baby. He adjusted his collar, gave a little shrug, and said with a smirk, Sarah's severance package was a technical overpayment anyway based on an outdated projection model. We redirected it efficiently toward retention incentives for agile-ready departments. Translation. They took her money and gave it to the CEO's pet project team, a group of overpaid former consultants who thought agile asterisk meant having 6 stand-ups a day and never answering emails. The HR director, Neen, chimed in. She was the kind of woman who wore beige like it was a power color and smiled like she'd invented passive aggression. We framed the transition as part of our fiscal hygiene initiative, she said, as if gutting someone mid-vacation was some kind of cleanse. Sarah watched all of this play out from 1,000 miles away, courtesy of Jack, her lawyer. True to form, he had a source embedded somewhere in Vyarch's legal department. She didn't know the mole's name, didn't want to, but the information came like clockwork, word-for-word summaries, screenshots, and the exact phrases they used to justify her erasure. Fiscal hygiene redirected efficiently. Technical overpayment. Sarah sat in the cabin, fire crackling low, laptop still unopened, read the updates like they were dispatches from another planet. One where her 14 years of loyalty had been surgically removed with the same enthusiasm as an infected tooth. She felt nothing at first. Then came the disgust, not just at them, but at herself a little. For how long she'd let it slide, for the birthdays missed, the holidays where her suitcase sat unpacked because someone needed a QBR scrubbed at 11 p.m. email. She answered from her dad's hospice room. All of it filed away under company first. And now she was a bullet point. Her name wasn't even said aloud in the meeting, apparently just legacy role, like they were referring to a discontinued product. The worst part wasn't the spin. It wasn't the smugness or the blatant reallocation of what she'd earned. It was the ease. They didn't flinch, no moral hangover, no pang of doubt because to them this was just good business. Sarah closed her phone. She didn't need to read anymore that night. Her lawyer had already replied to her forward from earlier. Subject Clause 12.4b body. They're about to learn the cost of efficiency. Sit tight. She looked out the window. The sky was dark now, but the stars were bright, distractingly so. Somewhere back in that office, a room full of suits was patting themselves on the back for trimming fat they didn't even know was muscle. Somewhere just below all that celebration, a clause was ticking like a landmine under the boardroom table. 2 days before the quarterly board meeting, the Vyarch Systems legal war room came to life in the way only lawyers can animate a spreadsheet with dread. It started as a routine scrub. External counsel brought in to cross-check the termination files ahead of audit sign-offs. Just boxes to tick, names, roles, severance amounts, standard procedure meant to make sure nothing could blow back in front of investors. But then one of the junior associates, fresh out of law school, probably still drinking boxed wine and quoting Succession, paused at a particular file. The termination packet for Sarah Wren. At first glance, it was clean. Terminated during PTO, yes, but the language was properly HR-sterilized kind of memo you'd expect to find next to a severance breakdown and a Slack deactivation notice. Except there was one small footnote nearly buried in the digital version under an obscure MER data tag, Clause 12.4b, Protected Status PTO Termination. The junior flagged it for review. By noon, 2 senior associates were staring at the clause on a monitor like it had started bleeding. It read plainly, the kind of elegance that only comes from someone who's been screwed one too many times and decided never again. Any termination executed during approved and active PTO, absent documented cause, or formal performance remediation shall incur immediate restitution of all forfeited benefits, retroactive pay, and vested equities. Additionally, a fixed penalty of $2,500,000 USD shall be levied upon breach, forcible within 5 business days of discovery. The outside counsel, a woman named Cora Richter, who'd spent 20 years cleaning up after arrogant CFOs and trigger-happy HR directors, leaned back in her chair and muttered, "Well, shit." She emailed it straight to the internal legal team with the subject, Urgent Clause Breach Risk 12.4b. Sarah Wren attached with a termination packet, original contract revision, a high-risk breakdown. An hour later, a reply pinged in from HR, reviewed and noted, "This appears to be a drafting relic. The clause was never activated. She's been processed." Processed. Cora read it twice, then picked up the phone. "Let me make this simple," she said, dialing the internal counsel at Vi. "This clause doesn't care what your HR thinks. It doesn't care about intent. It doesn't even care that your CFO signed it without reading. It's a ticking liability and you've got 5 business days." Silence on the line, then a sigh. "I'll escalate it." They didn't. Not really. Back in the executive suite, the whole thing was brushed aside like a gnat. The CFO gave it a dismissive glance during his call with the general counsel, muttering something about legally scare tactics. The HR director, Neen, called it an overwired redundancy. It was probably boilerplate she snuck in. If it was real, Eagle would have flagged it before, she said, sipping her $7 matcha and rearranging her affirmation post-its like that would stop litigation. Nobody bothered to look at the timestamp. Nobody checked the signature page. Nobody asked why Sarah, of all people, had been so calm after the axe fell, and nobody read the clause aloud. Not yet, but the flare had been launched. It was hovering now, glowing red just above the roofline, visible to anyone who dared look up. First lawyer had spotted it. The countdown had started. 5 business days. And Sarah, she was still offline, still invisible, still letting them think they'd gotten away with it. All right, people. Let's tighten this up before we get in front of the board tomorrow. The CEO, Gerald Tannen, adjusted his cufflinks like he was prepping for a Vogue shoot, not a quarterly reckoning. His voice had that brittle, hollow confidence of a man who still thought charisma could plug data holes around him. The senior executives arranged themselves like a firing squad with clipboards. CFO Greg Malin, HR Director Neen, Sales VP Marcus, and a clutch of lawyers who looked about one PowerPoint away from asking to be put down. In a stuffy 11th floor conference room, smelling faintly of carpet glue and hubris, the pre-board dry run kicked off with investor talking points and slide deck polish. They barely got through the second agenda item, workforce optimization, before a junior attorney named Paul cleared his throat too loud. I just want to raise something before we proceed. Clause 12.4b in Sarah Wren's contract. External counsel flagged it again this morning. Gerald didn't even look up. We've got it handled. But sir, the clause isn't standard. Paul pressed, hands shaking just enough to rattle the pen. He was gripping like a life raft. Mandates restitution and a significant financial penalty if an employee is terminated during protected PTO without proper cause documentation. The room paused momentarily. Greg, the CFO, didn't blink. She's gone. Move on. Paul blinked back. The language doesn't care if she's gone. It was triggered the moment that termination email was sent. We didn't document cause. She was mid-approved PTO. It's enforceable. Neen scoffed this again. Char vetted that file 3 times. We've been through it. You're wasting everyone's time. She added the clause 6 months ago. Paul continued, his voice flattening into dread. It's not fluff. It's enforceable. And our severance reallocation already hit payroll, which means she's not coming back. Gerald cut in. Do you see her in this room? No. Not going to let one disgruntled employee hijack an entire board presentation because some intern with a law degree got spooked by a footnote. Greg chuckled under his breath. Remind me to start adding 7-figure penalties to my contracts. Neen laughed too, missing entirely that she was the one who'd signed the final HR authorization without reading the full PDF. She thought it was a vacation extension request. In the back of the room, sank a little deeper into his chair and said nothing else. That was the culture at VARS. Don't question upward. Don't raise red flags. The only thing worse than a mistake was making someone important uncomfortable by pointing it out. Sarah knew this culture intimately. That's why she didn't speak. That's why she didn't send so much as a text. Why she didn't post vague subtweets or call old coworkers for tea. She just watched. Let the back channel purr to life. Her lawyer, Jack, was feeding her everything. Email chains, meeting summaries, internal memos. Someone inside legal was quietly horrified. Someone with enough integrity, or at least enough anxiety, to keep her informed without setting off alarms. Jack's last message was simple. They still think the clause is bluff, and they're about to bluff into open court. Sarah sat on the deck of the cabin, barefoot and calm, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders while pine needles whispered against the roof. She sipped coffee, added a splash of bourbon, and reread clause 12.4b for the 50th time, not because she needed to check anything, but because the symmetry of it felt good, surgical, clean, a scalpel against the neck of arrogance. She hadn't written it out of revenge. She'd written it because she knew people like Gerald and Greg and Neen, knew their rhythms, their blind spots, her love of shortcuts and disdain for details. Knew they would eventually screw her. All she'd done was leave a trip wire in the carpet, and now they were rehearsing their lines, fixing their collars and skipping right over the part where their foot was already on the wire. They wouldn't read it. Fine, they'd feel it instead. The boardroom at Vay Systems was a modern cathedral to corporate excess, glass walls, brushed steel accents, a table the length of a small runway, kind of place where millions were won or lost over muffins and jargon. That morning, the room filled slowly but deliberately, like a courtroom assembling before a high-profile trial that no one realized was already underway. Fresh coffee steamed from ceramic pitchers, pastries lined up like sacrificial offerings along the back credenza, and the air buzzed with the comfortable arrogance of people who thought they'd made all the right moves. CEO Gerald Tannen adjusted his tie and chatted up an investor rep about their upcoming human capital realignment. CFO Greg Min, already on his second espresso, laughed too loudly at his own anecdote about firing someone mid-vacation once at his previous company. Cold but effective, he'd said, as if management were a contact sport. The board members filed in old money and new egos, kind of faces that had long ago stopped caring about the names behind the numbers. They greeted each other like they were at a country club mixer, not about to get hit with a legal freight train. Among them sat Maria Lind, lead investor from Northwell Capital, sharpied and famously allergic to she didn't make small talk, just opened her leather-bound notes and scanned the pre-meeting deck. Before we start, she said without looking up, I'd like clarification on the line item referring to cost savings from Sarah Wren's removal. The room shifted just slightly like someone cracked a window and let in a draft. General Counsel Rob Delaney, gray suit, thin lips, not paid enough for what was about to happen, froze for a half-second too long. He'd been handed the packet this morning by a visibly sweating junior associate who couldn't make eye contact. That should have been his first clue. Certainly, he said, voice a shade too high. He opened the termination file with the reflex of someone diffusing a bomb, flipping pages quickly until he found the contract addendum. Clause 12.4b stared up at him like it had just blinked. He went still. Maria tilted her head. Problem? Delaney cleared his throat just reviewing the termination conditions. One moment. Gerald, noticing the delay, chuckled. It's all handled, Rob. We vetted that weeks ago. Rob wasn't laughing. His eyes scanned the clause again, then the signature page, then the timestamp, and then the blood drained from his face. Maria noticed. Counselor. Delaney closed the folder and laid both hands flat on the table. His mouth moved like he was picking words from a minefield. There appears to be an active clause in Miss Wren's employment agreement that may have been triggered by the timing and method of her termination. Meaning, asked another board member. Tapping their pen, he swallowed. Clause 12.4b. It classifies termination during protected PTO without documented cause as a breach of contract. The clause enforces mandatory reinstatement of full severance, benefits, and vested equities. Additionally, it applies a fixed penalty of $2.5 million due within 5 business days of the breach. Silence fell like a dropped anvil. Only sound was the quiet hiss of the espresso machine in the corner. Maria leaned forward. You're telling us that in an effort to save costs, this team has triggered a multi-million-dollar loss. Gerald opened his mouth, but Greg cut in with a nervous laugh. This is overblown. That clause, if it even holds up, is buried in fine print. It's not enforceable. Delaney didn't blink. It's on a signed revision, dated, digitally logged, vetted through legal channels, albeit poorly, and flipped the page. Signed by you, Greg. The CFO stared. That's not no, I didn't, it's your signature. Maria folded her arms. Was this clause disclosed during the severance reallocation? Neen in the corner shifted uncomfortably. We assumed it was a boilerplate relic. She never mentioned she didn't have to. Delaney snapped. More emotion in his voice than anyone had ever heard from him. She wrote it. She knew what you were going to do. And now it's active. Entire room sat frozen in an invisible wreck. They had poked something they didn't understand. Sarah Wren, legacy team lead, invisible woman, quietly removed mid-vacation to trim fat for Q3 optics. The cost-saving victory they all congratulated themselves over was now a grenade mid-detonation, and they were all sitting at ground zero. The room didn't just go quiet, it froze. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. Outside counsel, Cora Richter stood at the head of the table, her glasses low on her nose, holding the termination file like it was a live grenade with the pin halfway out. The kind of lawyer who didn't waste words or wear perfume. Her voice, when she finally spoke, cut through the tension like a scalpel through silk. She didn't editorialize, didn't just clear her throat and read. Clause 12.4b, 4b termination during approved PTO without documented cause shall incur a severance penalty of $2.5 million and nullify cost-saving treatment. Mandatory restitution of all benefits, back-pay, and vested shares within 5 business days. Her words landed like bricks. One by one, no spin, no jargon, just a legal hammer swung square into the glass face of their optimism. Silence followed. Not polite silence, not confused silence, condemned silence. Then in perfect sync like choreography rehearsed in some karmic rehearsal space, every head in the boardroom turned towards CEO Gerald Tannen. The first to look was Maria Lind, her gaze sharp enough to leave a burn. Then two investor reps, followed by the head of audit, and finally even Greg. The CFO slowly pivoted in his chair as if just realizing he wasn't at the top of the food chain. Gerald didn't speak, couldn't. His jaw worked uselessly, lips parted slightly like he was mid-chew on a sentence that had turned to ash. Cora closed the folder with a snap. "There's no ambiguity," she said. "The clause is enforceable. It's been triggered. There's precedent for this language being upheld in similar termination cases." Greg finally found his voice. "It can't be right. I mean, we never intended." She never objected. She didn't even reply to the email. Cora didn't blink. She didn't need to. The clause isn't about intent. It's about action. You terminated her. She was on protected PTO. No cause documentation. The trigger conditions are met. It's now an enforceable liability. Neen looked ready to pass out, but HR vetted it. "No," Cora said flatly. HR ignored it. "There's a difference." Rhea folded her hands slowly like she was counting backward to avoid flipping the table. "So, let me get this straight. We optimized our workforce to impress investors. Eliminated a role with protected status, reassigned that person's severance to retention bonuses, and now we owe her more than we saved." Cora nodded. "And we have 5 business days to make payment before breach escalates." A sick, dry sound escaped from Gerald's throat. Half gasp, half denial. She was quiet. She didn't push back. She wasn't a threat. Maria's eyes narrowed. Apparently, she didn't need to be. The head of audit whispered something under his breath. Another board member swore softly. Cora stepped back, gathering the documents like a surgeon putting away her instruments. "And just so we're all clear, this has already been delivered to our office in a pre-litigation packet. The moment this meeting ends, legally required to inform insurance." Greg palled. "Wait, what? Our retention policy? It won't cover this," she said. The clause was internal. "This falls under self-inflicted liability." The quiet deepened into dread. Sarah hadn't returned, hadn't said a word, hadn't marched in with lawyers or gone nuclear on LinkedIn. She just waited, patient, surgical, and now with nothing but one buried clause and impeccable timing, she'd gut-punched an entire executive team. Triggered a loss event the size of a minor acquisition. Gerald slumped back in his seat, sweating into his tailored collar, mouth finally forming a sentence. How the hell did we not see this coming? No one answered because they had. They just didn't read. The sound of ceramic shattering on tile echoed, like a gunshot. Gerald's coffee mug hit the floor at a sharp angle, spraying half of empty latte across the white oak floorboards and the hem of his own slacks. He didn't notice, didn't even flinch, just stared witty-eyed and pale at the contract packet in front of him like it had whispered his own eulogy. No one moved. Even the assistant who usually swooped in to clean up messes, the same one who brought Gerald his overpriced artisan blend every morning, stood frozen in the doorway, not daring to breathe. Because in that moment, the coffee wasn't the only thing that had spilled. Authority had too confidence, the whole illusion. CFO Greg Min leaned forward, face flushed, voice dry and shaky. "It's got to be a drafting error, a miscommunication. That clause, it must have been left in by mistake." He reached for the folder, flipping to the last page like a drowning man clawing out a life preserver. But there it was, black ink. Perfect signature. His right next to Sarah Wren's dated timestamped, digitally logged with the same verification the company used for onboarding Suite hires. "I started then. Just let the word hang there hollow. It's not a drafting error," Ka said, arms crossed now. "It's a trap one. She laid 6 months ago and waited for you to step into. And you did blindfolded one of the older board members, a man who usually fell asleep during earnings breakdowns and cared more about his tea time than termination protocol. Finally muttered something that cut through the tension like a dagger, dipped in common sense, triggered a loss event for nothing. No one argued because there it was. The reality laid bare. They hadn't saved money. They hadn't cleaned house. They hadn't made a smart fiscal move. They just yanked a thread from a sweater they didn't know was holding the whole damn thing together. And now it was unraveling in real time. Investor rep. Maria Lind stood slowly, the lines around her mouth deepening with fury. That breach alone might tank the retention pool. You understand that, right? If we don't restore what she's owed and pay out the clause penalty, it will trigger internal audit flags across all departments. Her voice was ice over steel. And if we delay, our liability insurer will declare it a preventable breach. That'll void coverage. We'll have to explain to our own talent why we raided the retention bonus to fund your HR fumble. Greg shook his head like a man trying to wake up from a nightmare. Wasn't even a core team lead anymore. Phoenix was legacy sunsetting. She'd gone quiet. She went quiet. Maria snapped because she already knew. You gave her motive, time, and a pen, and she used all three better than your entire legal department. Gerald finally spoke, though it sounded like he'd swallowed broken glass. Can we settle quietly? Ka didn't answer. She just reached into her briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope. Already underway, she said, dropping it in front of him. Per litigation notice. Served this morning, signed delivery. Greg stared at it like it might bite. Someone should have. No, Maria said, cutting him off, you should have. You fired a senior strategist mid-vacation without cause, reassigned her severance, and didn't even read the paperwork. She turned to Gerald. You dropped coffee. She dropped a clause. Only one of those broke something. Neen looked ready to vomit. Her eyes darted between the investors, the envelope, and the coffee stain widening across the polished floor like guilt made physical. Jesus, someone whispered from the end of the table. And still, Sarah didn't call, didn't threaten, didn't need to. Her silence was the loudest voice in the room. The door opened with a soft click. No fanfare, no dramatic entrance, just Jack Lavin in a navy wool coat and scuffed Oxfords, stepping into the boardroom like he was dropping off dry cleaning. He didn't look angry. He didn't look smug. He just looked prepared. He carried one folder, manila, unassuming, the kind that holds ruin when handled by the right hands. Jack Lavin, on behalf of Miss Sarah Wren, he said plainly, placing the folder directly in front of the CEO with the casual precision of a man who'd filed more lawsuits than birthday cards. Per litigation notification confirming breach of Clause 12.4b. Deliverables outlined inside. Payment deadline, 3 business days remaining. Gerald didn't take it. He just stared at the folder like it might detonate. Jack didn't wait for acknowledgement. He offered a polite nod to the room, turned and walked out. That was it. No threats, no lectures, no demands, just a handoff, clinical and irreversible. The silence left behind felt like gravity had increased. Gerald finally barked. Options? What are our options? General Counsel Rob Delaney didn't even look up. We have none. What do you mean none? Greg snapped, eyes darting. We're the company, we can renegotiate. Settle, shift the payment structure. No, Rob said, flipping open the notice and scanning it again. The clause is enforceable as written. She doesn't need to sue. It's already a liability event. If we delay, we'll breach again. Triggers compounding penalties and voids every retention clause we've filed this quarter. Neen opened her mouth, then closed it. Her face had gone the color of copier paper. Maria, the investor rep, stood and collected her things with the dispassion of a woman who'd seen empires fall over worse. We'll be discussing executive retention after this meeting and legal oversight, and whether this board is still viable to oversee fiduciary obligations. Buried his face in his hands. Gerald just stared down at the folder. Somewhere, a janitor would mop up the dried coffee from earlier and wonder why it looked like something had died in that room. But Sarah didn't see it. She was never going to. At that very moment, she stood barefoot in her cabin, flipping pancakes on a cast iron skillet. Outside the window, a woodpecker knocked politely at the birch tree. The morning sun streamed through pine branches. Phone sat untouched on the kitchen table beside a notebook filled with doodles, not deadlines. She didn't gloat, didn't rage post, didn't leak anything to the press. She just poured maple syrup on her plate and watched the steam rise. The clause had done all the speaking for her. 14 years of silence brushed aside like clutter, now distilled into one paragraph that cost them more than a whole quarter's headcount savings. They canned her severance. She just collected their retention bonus instead. Appreciate you sticking around, you wise old rebels. Smash that subscribe button or this fossil. might just cause another epic fiasco.